أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هل العالم جاهز لدونالد ترامب؟ هل دونالد ترامب جاهز للعالم؟ والآن بعد أن جلس في المكتب البيضاوي مرة أخرى سنكتشف قريبا الإجابات على هذه الأسئلة. ومقارنة بعام 2017 عندما دخل البيت الأبيض للمرة الأولى، فقد أصبح العالم مكانا أكثر خطورة ومليئا بالمزيد من الفرص. هناك حرب ساخنة كبرى تدور رحاها بين أوكرانيا وروسيا، والأيام الأولى من وقف إطلاق النار في حرب ساخنة أخرى بين إسرائيل وحماس. فالكوارث الإنسانية والمؤامرات الإرهابية والحكومات المنهارة والتهديدات بالحرب منتشرة في كل مكان، من منطقة الساحل إلى السودان إلى البحر الأحمر إلى شرق آسيا. وفي الوقت نفسه فإن الاحتمالات التغيير الإيجابي حقيقية في لبنان وسوريا على سبيل المثال. وفي إيران الخوف من السلاح النووي يقابله ضعف النظام المنكسر الذي لا يحظي بالشعبية. هل لدى فريق ترامب خطة لتحويل الفرص إلى النجاح؟ للحديث عن التحديات الدولية التي تواجه إدارة ترامب الجديدة، يسعدني أن أرحب بفريقنا المكون من خبراء السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to داخل Washington. He's now president, our 47th president, Donald J. Trump. And he faces not just a series of major domestic issues, but he faces the world. Let's take a look at the threats, challenges, and opportunities as the world faces Donald Trump. So I'm delighted to welcome Deniz Ross, Juan Zarate, our panel of foreign policy experts. Good morning, gentlemen. So Juan, from the perspective of the world facing Donald Trump, what are the threats, challenges, and opportunities that are posed out there?
Well, I think Donald Trump to the world represents massive disruption and potential convulsion, but there's also massive opportunity given the state of the world. We've been in a period of hot wars and conflict, regime changes, and certainly tension in different parts of the world. And certainly America's allies are worried about what Donald Trump administration part 2 looks like, with potential for trade wars and tariffs, challenges around territorial sovereignty, questions of whether or not the U.S. wants to be acquisitive of Greenland and the Panama Canal, these sorts of things that the president has declared. But also there are these changes happening in the Middle East, with Israel in ascendancy, in many ways, Iran on its heels, and the opportunities to reshape many of these relationships and the state of the world. And so in many ways, I think America's allies, especially in Europe and in North America, are a bit fearful of the chaos and some of the disruption that the Trump administration brings. Other parts of the world in the Middle East, maybe in Southeast Asia, allies are seeing opportunity for an America that is more aggressive, willing to use deterrence more explicitly, and willing to reshape the map, both literally and figuratively.
So a mix of fear and opportunity. Dennis, when the world looks at Donald Trump, how do you think it sees it?
I think this imagery of uncertainty, unpredictability, is something that creates both, to reinforce what Juan's saying, it creates an opportunity in some places. It certainly creates uncertainty and concern and fear in others. The interesting question will be, is Donald Trump as unsettling to some of our competitors like Vladimir Putin, like President Xi, as he is to some of our allies. If there is that same kind of uncertainty on their part, that gives him leverage. He absolutely has leverage in the Middle East. He has leverage with Bibi Netanyahu, who is clearly very reluctant to say no to him. But I think he has leverage as well with the Iranians, because I think they're uncertain as to what he might do. The irony is they may see he actually wants a deal. We're already seeing that you have the president of Iran indicating they're prepared to talk directly with the Trump administration. For 4 years, Iran would not talk directly with the Biden administration. So that suggests something not only about their weakness and vulnerability, but also a perception that there could be some value in talking to him. So I think it's, as Juan said, it's a very mixed picture. I do believe that he has a great deal of leverage, and if he knows and the people around him know how to take advantage of that leverage, we have some real potential to see an improvement across the board.
So that's how the world may view Donald Trump's ascension to the Oval Office. How do you think Donald Trump views the world? Juan?
Well, again, this is Donald Trump Part 2, the 47th president, not the 45th president of the United States. And I think he comes to the position with more experience and with a sense of momentum around his political status and capital in the United States. And so in many ways, I think that sense of both experience and strength is animating the way that Donald Trump is already acting as a president, with aggressive executive orders, with clear messages to allies and foes alike. And so I think it's giving him a more sure and aggressive tone in what he's doing. I think he's unapologetic in many ways. He was unapologetic in his first term, but in this regard, he's starting very aggressively and unapologetically for the policies and the things that he's been talking about now for many years. He wants to see an end to the war in Ukraine. He wants likely a deal for normalization to expand the Abrahamic Accords, to see the deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. He wants to see greater border security and more concessions from Canada and Mexico. He's aggressively talking about deals with respect to Greenland. I think that's despite the laughter that follows that line whenever he raises it. I think he is serious about the security that Greenland represents to him. So he seems more sure of himself, more aggressive from the start, and I think more unapologetic about the things that he's going to say and do. And that makes for a lot of tension and a lot of potential chaos, but also opportunity, as Dennis was saying.
Unapologetic, tension, chaos. Dennis, in his first 24 hours, Donald Trump discussed some foreign policy issues in his inaugural address, in his statements throughout the rest of the day, and through some of his executive orders. What can we take away from just those first 24 hours in the Oval Office?
Well, I think we have several things that we can take away from it. One, he means what he says about border security along our southern border. Two, he means what he says about using tariffs as a lever to get what he wants in terms of trade relationships. Three, he means what he says about wanting to be a peacemaker. I thought one of the important lines from his inaugural speech was he said, we're not looking, the measure of success is not the battles we win, but the wars we end and the wars we don't get into. So he sees himself as a peacemaker. It will be interesting to see, apropos of what Juan was saying, what happens when he's more certain, he's unapologetic. What happens when there isn't responsiveness to him, when he doesn't get what he's laying out, when he has a set of expectations that don't get fulfilled? How does he respond to that? That becomes, I think, one of the early signs we're going to have of how he's going to proceed. Will it produce breakthroughs or will it produce chaos? Will we have greater stability or will we have less? I mean, there's a lot that is potentially there that's positive, but you can also be unsettled by some of the negative things that could easily occur.
Interesting. So, I mean, Juan, from where I sat, I did not have it on my bingo card that we would hear Panama mentioned more often on his first day than Iran, China, Russia, or North Korea.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think this goes to both the personalized nature of foreign policy for President Trump and the transactional elements of it. And so President Trump is clearly viewing the world through the America First ideology that he has been the proponent of. And in that regard, when he is fixated on something and he feels that the U.S. is being taken advantage of or that there's unfairness toward the United States, he fixates on it. And I think that's exactly what you have with the Panama Canal, where he has a sense that the U.S. not only gave up a great asset in which it invested a lot of time and energy and manpower, but also that the Chinese are now taking advantage of it as well, to America's disadvantage. And so it raises this really interesting question, because I think the first term of the Trump administration was defined by a very transactional presidency, a very personalized form of diplomacy, to a fault, perhaps. What you have now is a question of, can he move into a deal-making role that is transformational, that looks like the Abrahamic Accords, for example, that takes advantage of the opportunities in the Middle East, in Asia, with China a bit weakened. Does he think about our allies as assets as opposed to challengers or those taking advantage of the U.S.? And so those are fundamental questions. With respect to the axis of aggressors, I think the reality is he and his national security team are going to be faced with the reality of those actors being the most provocative, the most aggressive, and the ones that are taking the most advantage of U.S. weakness. And so the reality of that, as he takes his briefings, as he gets into office, as he has to deal with the realities of crises around the world that he now owns, that I think will begin to take a more and more predominant role. And Panama and Greenland may fall by the wayside, even though it's an obsession of his at this point.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to continue this conversation, digging deeper into some of the regional challenges and asking what role his various advisors, whether it's Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, or Michael Waltz, the new National Security Advisor, are likely to play on key issues on the foreign policy agenda. In just a moment. My guests today include Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He authored The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Middle East peace, and Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel relationship from Truman to Obama. Dennis has 25 years of bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including service as the president's envoy for Middle East peace. Also joining us is Juan Zarate. Juan is one of America's leading counterterrorism experts. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism in the George W. Bush administration and was twice appointed by Pope Francis himself to sit on the board of the Vatican's Supervisory and Financial Information Authority. He is author of Treasury's War and Forging Democracy. Juan is the global co-managing partner and chief strategy officer for the consulting firm K2 Integrity and co-founder and chair of the board of Conciliant, an innovative fintech startup. Dennis, anything further that you took from his first 24 hours, his inaugural address and his early executive orders regarding foreign policy?
Yes, there was one statement he made that is really out of character given the way he's approached Vladimir Putin in the past. He said that Putin was destroying Russia with the war in Ukraine. Has a very different coloration than the way he has always approached Putin before. Obviously, it runs completely counter to Putin's own sort of narrative about what is going on in the special military operation. And it suggests that he's already signaling Putin, look, I'm going to apply some pressure on you. Don't take what I'm going to do as a given. I had believed that Putin has laid out a set of public conditions for peace that amount to a complete surrender for Ukraine. I have believed all along that some of those are giveaways that he was going to give to Trump as a way of saying to Trump, look, you're already succeeding with me. Look what I'm giving you. At least it suggests to me that this public posture is already signaling that maybe he's not so quick to surrender Ukraine to Putin. And from my standpoint, at least, that's a very positive development.
So if true to form, Donald Trump is eager to score some major quick wins, the notion of winning being so central to his language, his argument, his public persona. If you're looking around the world, Juan, what are a few quick wins that you think Donald Trump could score?
Well, I think there are many opportunities. I think if you look at Latin America, I think Venezuela is at an interesting inflection point. And with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, I think you're going to see more emphasis on Latin America, and especially where you have the convergence of Russia and China and Iran meddling in the region. And a fascinating part of what Donald Trump has laid out is this rejuvenated Monroe Doctrine, if you will. And I think there's something to that. I think in Latin America, you're going to see opportunities for reinforcing of alliances. Certainly with Argentina, with Milei, there's almost a love affair between President Trump and Milei. But I also think, given the weakness of the Maduro regime, the strength of the opposition, the reality of the recent election that the opposition clearly won, that Maduro is a fraudulent leader, I think there are some real opportunities there to shift the balance and maybe even to find a negotiated way for Maduro to step down. And so I think there will be pressure there. I think with China, the president has indicated a desire to meet with President Xi. And part of this is the personalized element of diplomacy. But I also think the president probably sees China in a position of weakness. Their economy is weaker than most think. They're vulnerable. There's isolation of China in many ways internationally. And so he may think that he can, with tariffs, drive further weakness with China, more concessions, and more of an ability to affect things in East Asia. And then finally, I think in the Middle East, I think giving strength to Israel to do what it needs to do to protect itself and to drive forward a deal with Saudi Arabia, which I think for him would be a crowning achievement of the Abrahamic Accords, which, of course, he and his administration brought forward in his first term. So I think those are three areas where he could push hard while also then trying to isolate Iran, maybe even begin negotiations, as you were alluding to earlier.
And Dennis, a major emphasis of his first 24 hours was border security, deportations of the criminals who are undocumented or illegal aliens in our country. With the huge focus that will be on this issue, is there going to be enough bandwidth in the administration to address this set of opportunities that Juan just laid out?
Look, I think that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, there's no doubt in my mind he will want symbolically to demonstrate that he's followed through on his promise, not just on border security in the South, but on the deportations. He's going to want to have pictures of people leaving. Now, that will put a premium, I think, on a Secretary of State being able to work out where people can actually go. So when you deport them, there's some place they can actually be received. So I think in the case of the Secretary of State, even though he will have an interest, I think, in Latin America in particular, that's going to be the focus. I think will be much more on how do I produce areas where people can leave. Having said that, I think it does put the president in a position where he will want to be able to show that he personally is producing some of the wins. One of the interesting things that I think that Juan was getting at in the Middle East in particular, he does have a priority of having Saudi-Israeli normalization. The Saudis, however, want to see an end to the war in Gaza with Israel out. Prime Minister Netanyahu now faces a very interesting problem because President Trump is taking the hostage deal as his success. Now, if it isn't fully implemented, it suddenly becomes his failure. So, that's a potential problem for Prime Minister Netanyahu, given the domestic, or at least the problems he has in terms of maintaining his own coalition. B, the idea that Israel will be out of Gaza soon, I think is also potentially problematic. And C, I would say, being prepared to concede towards the Palestinians, which will also be something the Saudis require, is also not going to be so easy. Now, I will link it to the last point that one made on Iran. The irony is that for Bibi Netanyahu, Iran has always been his Winston Churchill issue. Pardon the pun, it trumps every other issue. And if he had the right kind of understandings from Trump on what we are prepared to do with Israel on Iran to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, I suspect that Trump could get a lot from Netanyahu, both on Gaza and on the Palestinians. But it will require a pretty serious approach on Iran. And you raised the question of bandwidth. Someone is going to have to be able to be the one who's carrying the load on that. Steve Witkoff has demonstrated he can be a good mediator when it comes to negotiating on Middle Eastern issues. It'll be interesting to see what role, if any, he plays on Iran, because that will be central in the end to Bibi.
Very interesting that you opened with where the Secretary of State is going to put his priorities. I don't know if you gentlemen saw, but he issued his first directive to the department, and it was in terms of policy issues. The only real policy issue he focused on had to do with the southern border and with making sure that the department takes no initiative that promotes migration to the United States. Everything else he focused on was, getting rid of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion rules in the department and these sorts of things, but no reference to the other foreign policy challenges that might be on the American foreign policy agenda, China, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, etc. So it does seem as though, of anything, the southern border issue will be on the top of his agenda.
Well, I think there's a political reality to the new administration coming into force, including in the foreign policy establishment, national security establishment. So a way for the audience to think about this is, I think this administration is not only talking about America first, but it's an inside-out approach.
Thank you so much, Juan Zarate and Dennis Ross, for helping explain the early hours of President Trump's foreign policy. Thank you for joining me on داخل واشنطن. وبهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بتوجهات السياسة الخارجية في إدارة الرئيس ترامب، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.